I'm delighted to be back here. I spoke at the opening of the Foyle Justice Centre last year, which again was another fantastic event here in the Northwest. Today, I think for me, is great credit to Mary Brown and Foyle Women's Aid for their work in this research, to Alison for the research. I know that it's something that both Mary and Alison have been advocating for in terms of non-fatal strangulation for many a long year. And if they are going back to share their work with colleagues in San Diego, I am available at a small price. I'd also like to thank Patricia for her honesty and candour. I think, as it's been mentioned, nothing really strikes us more than hearing from someone who suffered domestic abuse. I did talk at the Foyle Justice Centre about some of my own experiences about family members having been victims of offences. So, from a policing perspective, we are no different than any other member of society. We see, feel and hear the same things as you, and we are absolutely committed to doing all we can to keep our community safe. For those who were at the Foyle Justice Centre last year, and I used the word about that event, about together and how we need to work together. When I read Alison's research at the weekend and she talked to it, the one thing that really struck me was I need to add to that word, and that's about being stronger together, and that we are stronger together. Now, for those of you who may recall, that was a campaign slogan for election for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. I'm not running for election, Mr. Mayor, you're fine, but I do think stronger together is a theme for me around where we have to be moving forward, both in terms of this research and how we end gender-based violence on these shores. Because I recognise, and we all recognise within policing, that no one agency can work alone to support those who are victims of crime and indeed prevent crime, particularly for those very personal crimes, such as domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and non-fatal strangulation. So for me, the launch of this research is a really strong message of the need to work and be stronger together. And I believe if we use this legislation and adopt those principles, we will work closer and better towards ending violence against women and girls. What I want to touch on today is three areas that are relevant. Firstly, I want to start with what's been a whistle-stop tour for me. I've been in this current role for coming up on 4 years. So I want to touch on some of the things that we've been doing from a policing perspective that are relevant to today, particularly with a focus on new legislation. Secondly, I want to talk specifically about the non-fatal strangulation offence from a policing perspective in relation to what we've been doing. You've heard of the specifics of the legislation from my colleague Louise in the Public Prosecution Service. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the future and some of the things that will be happening in the next year or so. So in terms of the past 4 years, as Mr. Burgess outlined, my role is in charge of the public protection for the PSNI for all of Northern Ireland. That's a job that's an honour and a privilege for me to do. I've said many times to colleagues, internal and external, it's by far the most challenging job I've ever done in policing, but equally it's the most rewarding when you feel that you can really make a difference to some of our most vulnerable victims in society, and frankly put the perpetrators of those offences before courts such as Mr. Burgess's. I want to touch on the domestic abuse offence because, as you heard, non-fatal strangulation quite frequently does happen within a domestic abuse setting. As you know, we've now had a standalone domestic abuse offence in Northern Ireland from February 2021. That was a much needed offence. Previously, I felt that from a policing perspective, we potentially were a bit hampered and maybe using other legislation such as harassment that just wasn't quite fit for purpose. So now having for 2 years that non-physical, coercive and controlling offence has been a real strength to the armoury of policing as to how we can protect you in our societies. You'll know some of these stats. We respond to a domestic abuse call every 16 minutes. That's a horrendous stat, but I suppose there is some comfort, if there's any, in the fact that we are seeing an increase in people to come forward and report domestic abuse to us, because we all know it was a significantly underreported crime. And 21% of all crime that is reported to the police is now domestic abuse. I used this stat last year and I'll use it again. We're here today, the timetable says for 3 hours. So in the 3 hours we're here, the police will receive 9 calls of domestic abuse in the time that we have sat here today. That's staggering. And really tells me that we need to work. And again, it was referred to by Alison as a societal issue, and it is, because frankly, we can't arrest our way out of this. Arresting people helps, but that's not the solution. The solution is a societal change and how we teach our young people, how we approach each other with respect, how we're active bystanders and not bystanders. Where we see things that are wrong, we speak out and we challenge it. Those are all things that we need to do. From a policing perspective, we have trained pretty much all of our operational officers. 6,500 people have undergone our domestic abuse training since it went live. We have been relentlessly pursuing perpetrators, and I'll touch a bit more on that later. Our outcome rate for the new domestic abuse offence, it was 38.5% last year, but due to the work that we've been doing to really drive support through working with the Public Prosecution Service and educating our officers and other judicial partners, probation, prisons and so on, the outcome rate is 45.9%. So that's really powerful for me in terms of the charges that we're putting forward where the domestic abuse offence has been believed to have happened. We've got really high arrest rates for the new domestic abuse offence. Where it's reported to us, we're arresting in 78% of those cases, again showing that we're taking this seriously in terms of stamping out that controlling and coercive behaviour. I'm always honest enough around the challenges. We don't get it right all the time. We're not perfect. Nobody is. But I'm open to challenge and I'm open to get better. And I strive every day to be the best that we can be. Two areas where we can do better is we're not great and we haven't been as good at, in my opinion, of adding the child aggravators. And that was a key part of the new legislation. And I don't think we've got that as good as we should. So again, our focus for next year in terms of our training schedule will be how we use the legislation better in applying those child aggravators. And the second point is the use of special measures. We haven't been particularly good, particularly at things such as achieving best evidence, video interviews for domestic abuse offences. They are timely and they are costly, but they're the right thing to do in certain circumstances. And again, I'm challenging myself and my own organisation to do better in those two areas. I next want to talk about Operation Encompass. Again, this is relevant to domestic abuse. Operation Encompass is something I've been hugely passionate about personally now for 4 or 5 years. And what it allows us to do, and it's now legislated, is provide information from a policing perspective to the education schools, to the Education Authority via the schools, where a child has been involved in a domestic abuse incident. So that might be that tonight a colleague and I go out to a call and a child was present. The child might even have been sleeping, but at the same time, they were there when that happened. And it's important that the school knows so that the school can put support and infrastructure around that child in a discreet way. Because let's be honest, a lot of children aren't going to have the confidence to tell the schools themselves. And it also helps the school understand if a child turns up dishevelled, maybe hasn't their homework done, has got no lunch, looks tired, whatever it may be. So it's a fantastic tool to protect our young in society. So as of now, as of May this year, we have rolled that out to every school in Northern Ireland. It took us about a year. We did it in a phased fashion, but it's a huge thing that we now provide that information to the school the following day or Monday if it happened at the weekend. And since we started this journey, as I say, 4 years ago, we've been doing it for about 2 years now since the legislation came in. We've made 13,279 referrals about our children to schools, which to me is really powerful in terms of protecting them, as I mentioned. Again, there are some challenges we're working through around how that information is passed and the IT systems that sit behind that, but that's work we'll continue to do to make it as efficient and effective as possible. Next, I want to talk about stalking protection orders. You may well know that those became live in terms of their use in Northern Ireland last month. We haven't had any applications through to the final stage of those yet. The first one is working its way through. But again, this is another really powerful tool to help protect victims, not only just in a domestic abuse setting, but we do know a lot of stalking happens in a domestic abuse setting, but also in other forums. We have trained again all of our officers. You will see on our website, if you go onto the police website, we have all of the details around stalking, and the acronym of 4 is what we use. It's fixated, obsessive, unwanted, or repeated behaviour. All of that information is there to both educate the public and our officers to do all we can together to prevent stalking and where it's appropriate, take forward an order. which allows us to put conditions on individuals who are suspected of stalking to either prevent them from doing certain things, i.e. not going to a certain place or at a certain time, but also positive obligations around undertaking programs to help rehabilitate them. I'll move on to the Gillen recommendations. Sir John Gillen, again, many of you will recall, published his report back in 2019 now in relation to improving how the system, particularly the judicial system, supported those who have suffered sexual abuse. That's been a journey we've been on since that period of time. In August of this year, in terms of from a policing perspective, we have rolled out what we've referred to as rape myths training to all of our officers. That's been co-designed by Nexus. That's to take away any stigma around people who report this, who are potentially in a relationship, and it gets down to all these arguments around consent. If someone says they've been raped, they've been raped, and that's where our focus has to be in terms of dealing and debunking any rape myths that exist. And that training, as I say, is being rolled out to all of our frontline officers with the support of Nexus. I mentioned previously about achieving best evidence interviews. We have developed and have a cadre by means of a pilot where all child abuse cases, be those sexual or otherwise, within the southeastern part of Northern Ireland are being taken forward by a dedicated team. We know from the judiciary, PPS and others about sometimes the quality of those interviews, even just around the sound and the lighting and so on. So by having that dedicated team helps us improve that. That is something we're hoping to roll out across all of my area of business, public protection, in the next 18 months. May require funding, but we're working through that as best as we can to do it in the most cost efficient and effective way. So in terms of the second point I wanted to touch on, so that's kind of all of the work that we've been doing that's relevant to, particularly around domestic abuse. But to talk then specifically about non-fatal strangulation from a policing perspective, the title on the slide is a new offence and an old issue with a question mark. It's not a question in my mind. It is an old issue, and that's something that I'm delighted that with the new legislation we can still start to help to address. As Louise mentioned, I mean, up until the 26th of June this year, the legislation that we were using for strangulation was written in 1861. So it's fair to say we were due new legislation under that Section 21 of the Offences Against the Person Act. The new legislation is something that we certainly lobbied for. I know obviously, and it's been mentioned, that the great work that was done here in the Northwest by Mary and others to get it into the legislative mandate. And again, thank those that supported it. And of course, the Department of Justice and the former Minister for giving us that legislation to help us deal with this offence more robustly. I'll be really honest, as an investigator of many's a year, it was challenging with the old legislation. And again, Alison talked about it from a human rights perspective, and I don't want to fail anyone in their human rights and upholding them as best as I can. But it was difficult, on a very practical sense, it was really difficult to prove it, because previously it was if someone sought to strangle someone, I then had to prove that they had an intent to commit another indictable offence. So it wasn't enough that I could prove that he strangled her. I had to prove that it was for another purpose, be that to murder them, be that to sexually assault them, be that to rape them. There had to be that other intent, and that made it really difficult. And you heard the figures, only 33 successful prosecutions of that since 2005. So we were long overdue this new offence, and I'm delighted that we have it at our disposal now. I'm also delighted that within that offence is the very, very clear Section 27 that makes it abundantly clear that there is no consent to harm for sexual gratification. That's just not a defence. So the fact that that is so definitive in the legislation to remove what was referred to previously as the rough sex defence is a huge benefit for us all. When I think about the benefits of the legislation, I've mentioned the rough sex defence, but again, it is more armour for police to deal with perpetrators of domestic abuse and take them off of our streets. As I mentioned about the complexity, it can be quicker because now we don't have that additional intent aspect. So that makes it easier to prove, and that can and hopefully will, and you've heard about some convictions already, support victims better by speeding up justice, and we all know that there are challenges in that area. It also will help us target enforcement and prevention, and this is really important for me. You heard again from Alison that we didn't keep the statistics. It wasn't a crime, so crime statistics didn't record where non-fatal strangulation took place. But now, because it's a standalone offence, we are and we will, and we're doing so. That'll help us because we'll very quickly build up a profile around what do we know, what's the age profile of the offender, what's the age profile of the victim, what locations in Northern Ireland does it happen in? Do we have a particular problem in a particular area? What day of the week does it happen? What time of the day does it happen? Are there spikes at weekends, seasonal trends, Christmas, Easter, whatever it may be? So all of that information that we'll now get will really help us from a policing perspective and way beyond policing to really target our prevention and education, because again, thinking about the Stronger Together approach, the legislation is only a small part of it. It's how we work together to use that legislation to prevent harm, and then when harm happens, to put those responsible before the courts. So those are the benefits for me, of which there are many. And certainly those are how I'll be taking them forward from a policing perspective. So what have we done? As well as obviously thinking about how we can pull all those things together going forward. Our preparation, we focused on the front line. The people who respond to these calls 24/7. And again, many of them are very young in service, because that's the way policing works. When you join the police, you start off pretty much on the front line, and then potentially move into different roles, such as a detective like myself. So we focused on the front line. We have trained 2,000 people in non-fatal strangulation alone to understand it specifically as an offence, and how we can ensure we get the best evidence to our colleagues in the Public Prosecution Service. And indeed, within 3 days of the offence going live on the 26th of June, we had our first person before the courts. And again, looking at our media at the time, we said, as part of its awareness raising on the launch of the new offence, the PSNI continued, on average, between 10 to 12% of domestic abuse victims have experienced non-fatal strangulation, placing them at the highest risk. In fact, studies have shown that in domestic abuse settings, victims are 8 times more likely to be murdered by their partner if they've previously strangled them. So our communications from the minute this offence became live, where there's anybody put before the courts, we are reinforcing those messages to encourage reporting and to really garner that support that we're stronger together by understanding this and driving our response to it. 8 times more likely to be murdered. That's a staggering statistic. We've worked with Professor Sarah Hull, some of you may know, who is the clinical director of the Rowan Sexual Assault Referral Centre, to really help us around the injuries, understanding the injuries, how to present those in an evidential perspective. Sarah's been really helpful and pivotal in helping us design our training. We've also held a session with the Public Prosecution Service together to help us understand, to ensure that what the prosecutors expect and what the officers are giving them align. That took place last year. So we've been doing lots in terms of our communication and our awareness. And in one sense, I'm delighted, but in another sense, it's deeply saddening too. But we have seen, bear in mind, 33 prosecutions in 15 years. Since this went live on the 26th of June, we have reported 232 people to the Public Prosecution Service for non-fatal strangulation, or we've sent files. 86 of those have been by way of charge, and a charge is the speediest way to get something to the Public Prosecution Service and allows us to be more robust in terms of not just police bail, but potentially court bail, to have better strengthening protection around those perpetrators. So that's an outcome rate of 37.1%. So means for optimism. Alison talked about optimism. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we've got this new legislation. We're using it alongside the other legislation. We are stronger together, and by doing these things, that's how we will end gender-based violence. So I'll move on then to my final part, which is around next steps. Again, in terms of the relevance to today. Mr. Burgess mentioned, I've had the pleasure and honour to lead on the PSNI's response to violence against women and girls for 3 or so years now. We did develop, through great consultation, our strategic intentions and action plan, which we launched on the 27th of September 2022. And actually, I'm grateful to Alison, who does in her work that we're talking about here today at 0.619 recognise, and I'll quote, in terms of policing, the PSNI is showing real leadership. We do feel that because we are behind, frankly, the rest of the UK in Northern Ireland. There is a national strategy supported by significant funding for violence against women and girls, be that for rape and serious sexual offences, be that for support for victims. I know the Executive Office are working behind the scenes to develop the strategy for Northern Ireland, but we are behind. So the PSNI, we couldn't wait. We wanted to go ahead, and we have our own action plan. But we look forward to working with partners, and we look forward, hopefully, to the launch of the Executive Office strategy next year. Our strategic intentions from our Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan are twofold: to contribute to having a society in which violence and abuse against women and girls in any form, anywhere, is not acceptable and will not be tolerated. And secondly, to build trust and confidence in women and girls in policing. And if I touch on the latter, I don't need to tell you that the trust and confidence in policing across the UK did suffer badly with the murders of Sarah Everard, with Ashley Murphy and these shores. So we know that there was challenges for policing, but I can assure you I'm resolute in addressing those by doing all the things here today to hope I can build and rebuild confidence in women and girls in policing in Northern Ireland. In the first 12 months since the introduction of our action plan, we've completed 23 out of 41 of our actions, which to me was great. We set out an initial 2-year action plan, so we're more than halfway there. The 3 themes that we're looking at are building trust and confidence in our officers, which I've touched on, but then also relentlessly pursuing perpetrators, which again I've touched on in terms of our charge rates, both for the new non-fatal strangulation offence and also for the domestic abuse offence. But then also in terms of how we protect people and make them feel safe in our society. So we are policing streets differently in respect to violence against women and girls. We have developed an IT geo portal, as we refer to it, which I can go into at any point in time, and I can, by the click of a button, list under violence against women and girls, and it will list the offences, there is a list of offences beneath that of which those constitute. But I can very quickly look at any geographical area in Northern Ireland and filter it and see where those violence against women and girls offences happen, be that over the last hour, 12 hours, week, whatever it may be. And that allows me to target my resources, not only in a proactive way, but in a preventative way, to help ensure that we have our officers in the right place at the right time, where we know crime has happened, particularly violence against women and girls, and stop it, do what we can to stop it. We've also taken a really different approach to designing out crime. So we never really conventionally, when you designed out crime before, we conventionally thought of how do you stop a burglar or a thief or whatever, but we never really thought about it in the context of violence against women and girls. So even things such as events. So we've developed a process whereby we input into the safety advisory group. Let's say, for example, the Halloween parade that they have in a city up here each year, or next year in Belfast, Belsonic, whatever it may be. A very key focus will be in the design phase before the certificate for that event is authorised, is to make sure that we designed out obvious things that could have presented violence against women and girls opportunities. Things such as the use of communal toilets. We have seen over the years young boys and girls getting access to porta cabins and staff standing by watching them, and this is 15 and 16-year-old children. So it's simple things like that around how we better protect our young and design out crime in that way. We're also looking at nighttime economy locations, as I mentioned. And again, you may well be familiar with the Ask for Angela work, which is really about educating bar staff, door staff, nighttime economy, hospitality staff to look out for the signs and symptoms of violence against women and girls, and where they see it, to report it to police. So we now have almost 400 bars and locations across Northern Ireland signed up to that scheme. And my thanks to Hospitality Ulster and Colin Neal for his support in that work. The Sexual Offences and Trafficking of Victims Act, as we know, that's where the non-fatal strangulation comes from. But there are still parts of that act to be enabled. And indeed, another 4 of those offences will become live on Monday. next Monday, so you'll see our comms on that. Again, these offences are very much about protecting or dealing with gender-based violence. So the new offences will be of cyber flashing. That will become a specific criminal offence. The voyeurism offences that we see and know, the upskirting, taking pictures, the down-blousing, taking inappropriate pictures, those become criminal offences in Northern Ireland on Monday. One that's become really common, and we're delighted to have the legislation for, is someone masquerading as a child online. So I'm an adult going online pretending to be another child, and then indecent images and blackmail occur, which we know has happened way too much. So there's a specific offence of masquerading online. And then threats to release private sexual images. And again, we know how prevalent that has been across society. That in itself becomes a criminal offence, because we know the devastating effect that has had on society. In preparation for all of those new offences, again, we have been delivering significant training to our first-line responders. And as I said, you'll see communications on those over the following weeks. Then next year, we'll also look to focus on domestic abuse protection notices and orders. That remains one part of the Domestic Abuse Act, which is still yet to be enacted. And that is effectively, again, a bit like a SPO, a stalking and protection order, whereby in a domestic setting, if someone is suspected of committing the domestic abuse course of a controlling behaviour offence, we can put certain conditions on them, akin to but separate to bail, which will allow us to manage them in a way to prevent them from reoffending and causing further harm to the victim or any other victims. So there's a lot going on. So in summary, that's been a whistle-stop tour. I did say I would stick to my time, but I'm happy to talk to anyone after. I do hope it gives you an insight. It gives me optimism, I hope you, to the work that your police service has been doing over the past 4 years and what we'll continue to do over the next number of years. A reflection for me in terms of having read Alison and her team's work was section 6.9. And it's the chord that keeps striking loudly here today. And I'll just quote what Alison said, if I may. While the new legislation is encouraging, what is likely to make the most significant and long-lasting impact is a change to societal norms through awareness raising, education, training, and enforcement. The mindset of individuals and organisations must change. That is when we will see a real difference. So I echo those sentiments from my perspective. The legislation is really impactful and really helpful, but we have to be stronger, working better together. So what do we need to do to be stronger together? Well, I think everyone in this room, firstly, has a role, be that as a parent, be that as an active bystander to call out when you see what's wrong, to be a role model for your colleagues. You may be an employer or an employee, but particularly also I think there's a significant role for schools in terms of education. Then there's the justice asks from police, the Public Prosecution Service, courts, prisons, probation, in the enforcement aspect that Alison mentioned, and rehabilitation. So by being stronger together, we can deliver on the recommendations within this research by doing what it tells us to do. So thinking in that, I want to finish with a quote on that particular theme. I don't think there's a better quote than what Mother Teresa once said. And she said, "I can do things that you cannot. You can do things that I cannot, but together we can do great things." So it's a challenge to me and a challenge to us all that let's do great things and together deliver what the recommendations say, use this legislation wisely, and end non-fatal strangulation and gender-based violence on our shores. Thank you.